Hi guys, our group is group 6 and we're going to be talking about drugs, teen suicide, and school bullying. My name is Jasmine and I'll be talking about the drug segment.
My name is Ruby Rodriguez, and I'm going to be taking over the teen suicide segment of our presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Garcia. I'll be talking about all three topics, drugs, teen suicide, and school bullying, but I'll be providing statistics and prevention tips.
And my name is Adam Powell, and I will be talking about the bullying section of the presentation. Our project objectives for today is students will be able to identify how drug use, teen suicide, and bullying affect the daily lives of students within the public school system. And our students will also be able to implement measures that may prevent drug use, suicide, and bullying. Bullying is, by definition, it's been recognized as the leading worldwide public health problem. That was pretty much determined by the World Health Organization. They determined that it's such an integral part of our lives. And it's one of those things where we love violence and then we hate it. You know, we love it in the movies. We love, we love it in sports, whether it's boxing, MMA, or football, but we also despise it, when it takes place in a place like a classroom or a school and, situations get out of control. So violence is one of those things. It's such a part of American culture that it's weaved in the fabric of it. So much so that bullying is a concern that October is now considered the National Bullying Prevention Month. There's a lot of conceptions and misconceptions about bullying, and we're going to try to address most of those. Bullying is defined by the CDC as unwanted, aggressive behavior by another youth or group of youths who are not siblings or current partners that involves an observed or perceived power imbalance and is repeated multiple times or is highly likely to be repeated. Bullying may inflict harm or distress on the targeted youth, including physical, psychological, social, and educational harm. So bullying is it's a very dynamic thing, but in order for it to truly be bullying in the sense of the definition, it has to meet three criteria. The first, it has to be repetitive, which means it's not a one-time incident where, a girl fights another girl because they disagreed on a matter. Bullying takes place repetitiously. It has to have some intentionality behind it, which means that it's pretty much done on purpose. And it's basically an abuse of an imbalance of power. There are three types of main bullying that can take place. The first is physical, the second is verbal, and the third is a type of social or relational. We're going to talk a little bit about cyberbullying, which is its own unique thing. But first of all, when we talk about bullying, what we're really talking about is student and child rights. These rights pretty much include having the place to go to school and learn in a safe environment, and also to experience a quality education. A lot of times the words bullying and harassment are used almost interchangeably, but there are some distinct differences. And it could be a little slippery sometimes to try to distinguish the difference between the two. But what I can tell you is, well, let's just talk about what these things share, what bullying and harassment share. They both include power and control, aspects of power and control. Between a target, which is usually bigger in size, and a target which is usually smaller, and a bully which is usually bigger, if we're talking about size. It involves some type of action that harms. And it also is a type of behavior that the person being affected by it is having a difficult time making it stop. Okay, so those are the things that are similar about it. The difference between bullying is pretty much when it comes to harassment, Oh, hold on. Let me get my thought. Bullying can it's a lot like harassment, but when it's harassment, basically the primary motivating factor behind it is based on like your ethnicity, your religion, sexual preference, gender, age, disability, LBG, QTQ, and your national origin. So if it's one of those things that the person who's the bully is targeting you because of what you are, because of your ethnicity, because of your, you know, your preferences, because of your religion, then it is considered harassment. Now, policies are usually handled by schools and school districts. You know, they usually have policies in place where harassment is a much bigger thing. When it's determined that harassment is involved, it usually gets turned over to the school district, the city, and state, and it can even become a federal type of matter. So they're both serious business, but harassment usually has to do, like what I said, origin, age, sex, gender, those types of things. Bullying has to do with the dynamic of power. So there's an imbalance of power. It could be either in size or social status within a group, or a group size or group of people or person. Power is usually achieved by knowing a person's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. So what happens is the bully increases in power, and as this happens over this time, the victim actually becomes more powerless. And I was supposed to already go to that slide, apologize. I'll just give you a second to read that. Now, there are three different type of bully behaviors. I labeled these aren't like proper terms, but one is reactive, one is sociopathic and psychopathic, and the other is adaptive. The first one is the one we usually associate with like a bully who was also bullied. So they call that a victim bully. And those people usually have aggressive personality patterns that drive their behavior. Where you have the sociopathic and psychopathic, those types usually have some type of empathy problem towards others. So it's basically an issue where like if it was sociopathic, then it would be more like just not being able to relate, where psychopathic would be like they don't really feel any way towards it at all. They have no feelings towards it whatsoever. The bullying as a function can also be adaptive. So these are people who basically use bullying as a mechanism to get what they want. And these are people who are considered, they're pure bullies. It's usually this type of bullying that takes place is usually in a social setting where groups of people are shunning other groups of people. It could be a sports team that is not going to be accepting of one person to be a part of their group or clique. Some of the effects of bullying, what we understand about bullying is that it affects the victims, the bystanders, and the family. So, and it also affects I don't think I put that in there, but it also affects the bully as well. It can affect the bully in various ways. There are certain things you can look for, like if they're withdrawn, if they have a lack of focus, if they're antisocial, or they experience a lot of mood swings or a change in appetite. I pretty much just described a teenager, but there are other things. If you notice certain shifts in behavior, the emotional effects like low self-esteem, insomnia, depression, and suicidal thoughts. We do know that historically there have been people who have committed suicide as a result of bullying. And it's really hard to determine. You can't really just say it was bullying. It's usually multiple things when it comes to suicide, but that's not my topic. It can also manifest in health problems such as stomach issues and headaches as a result of stress. And you'll see that these kids, a lot of times they miss school more frequently, and that can actually affect their academic performance. One thing is, if you have a student and you know that they perform very well, and then all of a sudden their grades are slipping and it's almost like they're not there, you may want to talk to them and see if there's a way you can assist, because that could be indicators of bullying taking place. As far as the frequency of bullying, we all know that anybody can be bullied. Even if you're a large person is still smaller than a group of people that can, and groups of people do have power. They do have some significance, especially if they're a part of that social hierarchy where they're the most popular kids in the school, the most popular crew, the most popular clique. These are groups that just people want to be a part of. So if you are shunned by those, you can be a person my size and still be socially affected by it. Your feelings get hurt. We're humans. So any student can be a victim. What we do know is that bullying takes place. In the numbers, depending on which studies there were so many numbers. I just generalized. It can happen between 12 and 25% of all students were bullied at some point. Usually these type of bullyings are like social bullying, but obviously there are physical instances where it usually doesn't start physical. It usually escalates to that type of behavior. It happens most in middle school between kids that are in between the ages of 12 and 15. And as you go through middle school and high school, you actually see less frequency of it. And by the time they've reached their senior year, a lot of bullying behavior has subsided, We know that it takes place proportionally between boys and girls. There's no group that does it more, really. We do know that when boys do it, it tends to be more physical and verbal. And when girls do it, it's more verbal and social, even though any type of bullying can take place over any group of people. Some of the reasons people get picked on is just because of, like I said, it can be because of their size. They may be obese. They may just be a minority. They may be an English learning student. They may be a person with disabilities. And I don't think I mentioned that when a person is targeted because of their disability, that becomes harassment automatically, because they're being targeted because of something that they have no control over. Obviously, things like differences in appearance, they can go attack the pretty girl. They can attack who they think is not the pretty girl. It could be social status. But what I can say about one of the misconceptions I had is that I didn't believe that bullying was a very organized way to go about things. But bullies they tend to be winners. They tend to pick targets that they know they can win against. So in a sense, they're a lot like profilers. They assess a situation and they pretty much set themselves up to win. So bullying is a lot, it takes place that way a lot of times.
General strategies that parents can use. The first one being use an authoritative parenting style. So this parenting style offers warmth, love, and closeness, but it still provides clear and high expectations for children. So you want to set those standards high, but you also want to show love and affection to your children. Parents are expected to hold their children up to those high standards and support them when they need it. Another strategy that parents can use to prevent bullying is providing a positive family climate. So parents must model the kinds of relationships they hope their children cultivate. Families must be supportive and help guide children in times of need. And family members work together, cooperate, and communicate effectively with one another. So again, you want to show a positive family environment, so that way when the children are out there and modeling those positive ideas. A third tip to help prevent bullying as a parent would be to teach emotional and interpersonal skills. So parents should be able to talk about their feelings openly with their children. This will help children deal with difficult times and allow them to be able to talk about what they're feeling. Parents should encourage supportive friendships and peer groups, so you want to make sure the children are talking with supportive friends, students that want to succeed, and you want to help your student create a growth mindset. So you want them to be able to achieve as much as they can. The final tip to help reduce bullying is by cultivating relationships with school personnel and other parents within the community. So if to prevent bullying, you want to make sure that you are actively communicating with teachers, principals, other parents, just so that way you can get the facts and get both sides of the story if bullying were to ever occur. On the next slide, let me see. So how educators can stop bullying. Again, like 5 main tips. The first one being, as an educator, you want to create a safe and supportive environment. So this means creating a culture of inclusion and respect for all of the students in your classroom. You want to make sure that you're monitoring student-to-student interaction within your classroom and on campus. So again, as an educator, you want to be on the lookout for things that don't look right or look a little off in your students and how they talk to each other, how they interact. A second tip for educators to help stop bullying is manage classrooms to prevent bullying. Again, you want to create rules with the students that are centered around respecting one another and responsibility to one another. As an educator, you want to reward good behavior and help students understand why they are violating the rules and what those consequences are for violating the rules. As an educator, you want to stop bullying on the spot. So you don't want to just kind of sit back and see how it plays out. You want to intervene immediately, and you want to talk to both parties individually. You want to make sure that as an educator, you're getting both sides of the story, and you're not just getting a biased story from one of the parties. And again, that ties into the fourth tip. You want to find out what happened. You want to make sure that the students are separated and they explain what happened and why it kind of started. The last tip, if you want to help stop bullying, is to support the kids involved. So you want to support all students involved, the bully and the bullied, so that way you can get both of those parties the correct support and resources that they need in order to learn from the event and to stop the bullying. So we have on the next slide some essential questions. So just a couple questions to consider. With the recent understanding of how bullying impacts everyone involved, what insight have you gathered to prevent and combat the effects of bullying? A second question to consider, think about a time when you have witnessed some type of bullying. Based on what you know now, what would you have done differently in that situation?
Okay, looks like it's my turn. So I'm going to be talking about drugs, but my section of the presentation deals with drugs, but more about their effect on the well-being of adolescents. And by adolescents, I mean individuals within the ages of 10 and 19. So the age of adolescence is a time in which the body and the brain is undergoing a series of developments. And one of the biggest developments is the prefrontal cortex. It's located in the frontal part of the brain, and it is the last part of the brain that matures. So during adolescence, like I said, the prefrontal cortex is not completely developed yet, and it only manages to reach maturity in early adulthood, which is usually around the age of 25. A fully mature prefrontal cortex regulates complex cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functioning. So like you can see in that picture that I have provided for you, that pinkish color, that's where the prefrontal cortex is located, and its position is significant as well. So because of the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, teens are more likely to fall into difficult situations. That's just because of the way that the prefrontal cortex is kind of conditioned to, well, not conditioned, but more its purpose is to kind of help guide people in thinking a specific way. By cognitive functions, I mean decision making, critical thinking, the ability to think, plan, and solve problems. And it also helps with creating self-control over impulses, which is a key issue when dealing with drugs and teenagers. Okay, on the next slide, I'm going to be talking about trauma. So a big factor that leads to drug abuse is trauma. Because adolescence is a target developmental stage that childhood trauma can severely affect the adolescent's life. A study that was conducted by Brown University, which included 9,956 adolescents from the ages of 13 to 18. One behind. There you go. Thank you. So basically, during this trauma stage, a lot of researchers are interested in why the brain reacts the way that it does. And in this specific study, they wanted to see the correlation between drug use and mental health. And this specific study measured that mental health status by asking questions about potentially traumatic events, which are called PTEs. And they're basically events that impacted the individual's mental health at some point in their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder is kind of the effect of that one event. So it's defined as a mental health condition that is triggered by a terrifying event. Some symptoms of this include flashbacks, nightmares, and anxiety. So during this study, they found that the more PTEs, or potentially traumatic events, that the individual experienced led to a greater likelihood that the adolescent would abuse drugs. So in this specific study, they found that 36% of the sample meaning the people that were tested, reported at least one PTE before age 11. So that's, a third of basically all the people that they were able to test had reported that something traumatic had happened in their lives. And although some people have different ways of kind of working around it, not necessarily everybody knows how to work out those nicks and kind of recover in a positive lens. So as a prevention effort, the researchers believe that it would be helpful for the individual who is dealing with these traumatic events to seek medical help, in the sense of a psychologist or somebody that could help them talk through it. Because if they're not provided with the proper medical care, they will turn to drugs and alcohol because it seems like an easier way out. Okay, next slide is the effects of drugs. So effects of drugs on the developing brain. The biggest issue with the effects of drugs is that the adolescent's brain is not completely developed. It's in a developing state, and basically any form of drug use can harm or cause long-term mental issues. As we see that picture on the right, we see a normal brain, a cocaine abuser 10 days in, and a cocaine abuser 100 days in. And those bright lights are basically signals that the brain is sending each other, and it's mental activity. So as it continues to digress, progress the amount of days of abuse, there's less mental activity going on. And that's a huge problem because, like the bullet points say, there's drugs impact the way the brain processes things. And at this specific moment in their lifetimes, adolescents have trouble, just in general, making decisions and doing things like that. So when you add drugs to the system, you're making it even harder for them to make these decisions. So there's problems with decision making that occur, and this causes the adolescents to kind of act irrationally and not really think about what they're doing. Drug abuse also makes it difficult for the adolescent to practice their critical thinking skills, which means that the adolescent has trouble seeing the positive and negative aspects of his or her decisions, I guess. These issues are both effects of the damaged synapses that occur because of drug use. So synapses, or a synapse, is the structure that permits a neuron to pass an electrical signal to another neuron. So when a synapse is damaged, the brain becomes unable to process any damages that may be happening to the body. So it kind of blurs what's actually happening with the physical body. As the brain continues to be damaged by drugs, the brain's activity just becomes less widespread. And that's what the picture is supposed to show, that initially you have mental or brain activity happening everywhere. And towards the end, you're seeing only in specific areas. Next slide. Okay. So in recent years, we have all seen, I hope, because I've seen them multiple times, commercials that are kind of arguing against cigarette use. And it's led to, you know, a huge decline in tobacco use. Now, we see cigarettes as being a very big issue in the United States because it's everywhere. Somebody could be smoking and it affects the person individually, but it also affects the people around them. Maybe not necessarily in the exact way, but it still does affect people around you. And these efforts, the commercials, have been proven to be successful because, like I said, tobacco statistics have decreased dramatically. But a new form of cigarette has emerged, and I'm sure Mark's going to talk about it later. But it's basically an e-cigarette or a vape pen. And the thing about vape pens is that they're using nicotine, which is extracted from tobacco. So it's essentially using cigarette, what you would use in a cigarette, you're just not using the paper. And even worse is that vapes contain sometimes wax, which is really concentrated marijuana. And it just makes the situation, you know, even worse. Even though we saw this huge dramatic decline in cigarette use, we're seeing another sort of incline, I guess, or increase in a different form of nicotine. So basically, the only way to stop this reemergence is to educate all people about the negative effects concerning vaping. They kind of see now how cigarettes are bad, but they don't really see the negative aspect of vaping. And it's important to kind of educate them that way. So physicians play an important role in the prevention of drugs because they're able to see the signs of someone who is abusing them. And if the physician is able to catch it early enough, they can provide assistance to help the adolescent's health improve. Next slide. Okay, so as I have explained, drug abuse affects the brain and its ability to operate correctly and efficiently. However, drugs can also lead to other problems. And one of the biggest problems is that drugs can lead to sexually transmitted diseases. Now, this occurs in multiple different ways. It could have to do with the mental status. I've explained to you what the prefrontal cortex has, why it affects the prefrontal cortex. But specifically, it clouds your judgment and it makes your decision making and your ability to make decisions unclear. So in that sense, it does appeal to the mental status. But another issue is that when drugs are taken, people are not necessarily in the right mental state to take them. And sometimes, like specifically in injection drugs, unsanitary conditions can lead to sexually transmitted diseases. And a huge STD that has been caused because of injection drugs or kind of progress even more is AIDS. So AIDS is a deadly disease with no cure, and it makes the body unable to fight infections or diseases. So it kind of creates an immunodeficiency within the person, and it just makes it difficult for the person to live when it's coming into contact with so much germs and just normal sickness that a person can fight off. This person has a difficult time doing. So an important fact to keep in mind is that it might not seem like AIDS is very prevalent in today's society because we don't really come into contact with it a lot. But to kind of give you an idea of how prominent AIDS is, in the lives specifically of adolescents, 1 out of every 6 new HIV or AIDS infections were in people between the ages of 13 and 25. So that's a big number. Although we don't see it, we don't talk about it that much. AIDS is definitely out there, and it's a situation that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about drugs, and when we're trying to explain to individuals to, you know, be safe, and to kind of exercise the proper ways to go about these things and talk about these things. We just need to educate everybody more, because needle sharing is not acceptable and is very dangerous. A key point that I want to kind of address is that drug addiction is a brain disease, because the abuse of drugs lead to changes in the structure and functioning of the brain. So drug addiction makes it not only difficult to kind of live your daily life, but it kind of blurs your mental status and kind of doesn't really let you see things for what they are. Because people can see drugs and say, yes, they're bad, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to use them anymore. Next slide. So I included the pediatrician's role because, like I've talked about before, the physician is a key integral part of having prevention of drugs as a whole. These pediatricians or even physicians are supposed to keep an eye out for the indicators. When an adolescent goes into their office, they're supposed to ask questions and create a safe environment, and an open one where the adolescent feels comfortable enough to share their personal information, their opinions, whatever it may be. It is also important to have the physician explain the meaning of confidentiality, because a lot of adolescents will share information that the doctor by law has to share with police if it puts that individual in danger. So while you are a safe haven for them, you have to let them know that if it means them being in trouble, you will report to the police. So you have to be strict, you have to be informative and listen closely to what they're saying, but also provide a lot of support. Next slide. Okay, the parents' role, very important. And it goes along with like what Adam talked about with bullying, what I'm talking about with drugs, and what Ruby's talking about with suicide. The parents' role is the biggest role to play with their children, because they have to be able to communicate. Even if it's difficult situations, like they want to talk about sex or they want to talk about drugs, the parents have to be there to listen to everything, whether it's good or bad. They have to have those conversations with them. So my biggest point is to communicate. It doesn't have to be specifically about drugs, but just knowing who your child is and what kind of things they come into contact with is a very important part of helping that individual grow. Also make sure the adolescent is doing well in school, listen to their worries and put them at ease if you're able to. Help them find healthy solutions or resolutions, so that they don't feel like they're alone in the world and they know that they have someone to rely on. So be tough, but loving at the same time. And in other words, protect them and do all these things, make sure they know what is required of them, but also love them and try to help them out. Okay, so Ruby is next. Or sorry, Mark is next.
Awesome, thank you, Jasmine. So as Jasmine had mentioned earlier, vaping is on the rise. It's surging through these adolescents. By definition, vaping is the act of inhaling and exhaling nicotine, marijuana, THC, or other drugs as a vapor rather than smoke. We see that it's raising in popularity with these students. Approximately 2.1 million middle school and high school students were using e-cigarettes or vape in 2017. So a couple of reasons why it's been popular with the students is it's easy to conceal, it's easy to hide, it has little to no odor, the flavors are nice, they like to experiment, it helps them relax, and it is addicting because it has nicotine or marijuana or other drugs, and that can definitely affect their brain, as Jasmine had mentioned. On the next slide, we continue to talk about vaping. Although health risks are associated with vaping, they may seem less severe. There are still some known risks at the moment. So high levels of nicotine, for example, the popular company Juul states that one pod is equivalent to one pack of cigarettes. The high levels of nicotine make vaping extremely addicting, and again, it could cloud students' judgments, considering that their brain isn't fully developed until the age of 25. And vaping can impact a person's ability to focus, especially in teens. So that's one way that we can indicate, well, maybe not indicate, but that is one thing that we're looking out for if students are unable to focus. On the next slide, we begin to talk about monitoring the future. Monitoring the Future is the longest continuously conducted survey of drug use in America. It began in 1975. It's a survey that's conducted every year by researchers from the University of Michigan, and it spans the United States and surveys schools from across the country, both public and private schools, and provides questionnaires to over about 45,000 students in grades 8th, 10th, and 12th. This is an accurate depiction of actual drug use of kids from the United States. In last year's survey, considering that the surveys are always conducted in December, so from last year's survey, there was approximately 44,000 students from the grades 8th, 10th, and 12th that were surveyed. And as we can see in the pictures, roughly 9.6, 19.9, and 25.5 of those students have vaped nicotine in the past month. That is a 4% increase in 8th graders, 10% increase for 10th graders, and 12% increase for 12th graders since the year of 2017. So again, we can see the rise in popularity among these students. Similarly, if we look at the graphic for the levels of THC, we have about 3.9%, 12.6%, and 14% of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders respectively vaping THC in the past month. Again, if we're looking at the rise in comparison to 2017, that is respectively 1.5%, 8%, and 10% of THC vaping for students in 8th, 10th, and 12th grade. It may not seem harmful, but the consistent use of vaping can be harmful to the minds and bodies of our students. As again, we've mentioned, the adolescent brain is not fully mature until the age of 25. On to the next slide. I will have Ruby take over from here.
Okay, so like I mentioned, I'll be talking about suicide and especially about teen suicide. Suicide is a complex issue as it involves many factors that can increase the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Some risk factors include mental health and substance use issues, financial difficulties, physical illness, and social isolation. Suicide causes are to be attributed to several psychological and biological and environmental factors, like one or more mental or substance abuse problems, impulsive behaviors, undesirable life events like being bullied, like Adam mentioned before. The recent loss of a family member, for example, family history of suicide or past suicide attempts, and finally, the exposure to the suicidal behaviors of others, like the family or peers. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. Like I mentioned before, suicide is a complex issue, so today we'll be focusing on youth suicide. It occurs when a teen causes his or her own death on purpose, but before trying to take their own life, they may have thoughts or of wanting to die. It is known as suicidal ideation. Suicide becomes a measurable public health problem once children reach middle age or middle school. It is the second leading cause of death among youth aged 10 to 24. According to the research I did, boys are 4 times more likely to die from suicide than girls. Girls are more likely to try to commit suicide than boys. And for every completed youth suicide, it is estimated that there are 100 to 200 attempts. And finally, there were 3,994 completed suicides among people between the ages of 15 and 24 in the year 2000. Thank you.
My name is Claudia. I'm from Anaheim, California. My sister died by suicide on December 9th, 2015. My sister's name is Catherine Gutierrez, and she had the most beautiful eyes. They were green, and she was so full of life. She had really long hair. She was so proud of it. She was just so funny and witty. I have never met anyone as funny as she is. I don't think she saw those things about herself. In the summer of 2013, we got a call from the school telling us that we needed to go because my sister had been cutting herself. We didn't realize it until her PE teacher, obviously they changed into their gym clothes, and he noticed the cuts on her arm, and she had been hiding them. She would always wear a long sleeve, and that was typical of her to wear a sweatshirt, so we didn't really think much of it. But we went and we talked to the psychologist at the school, and she told us, that maybe Catherine needed to open up and tell us what's going on. And that's when she started telling us that she had been having suicidal ideations at that point for a couple of years. But we didn't know any of this. We didn't know that there was a problem until she started cutting. After she started cutting, everything happened really quick and things went downhill really fast.
Through the research I did, researchers found a strong correlation between low educational achievement, examination, and school performance stress, and between suicide. They identified the following 10 characteristics in order of importance as critical risk factors in teen suicide. The first one, hopelessness. Second, communicated ideation or plan. Previous attempts, mood level, quality of variety of relationships like with friends and family, depression, degree of social integration, recent relationship loss, mental status like orientation, and the degree of willingness to accept help. Yeah, can you move to the next? Thank you. Youth suicide, again, it's critical, or it's really an issue when the developmental changes combined with stressful life events on a teen come together, and they act like a time bomb, actually. And other factors include suicide contagion and suicide clusters. In the next video, I'm gonna be explaining a little bit more about this. Some warning signs of teen suicide include the changes in eating and sleeping habits, loss of interest in normal activities, withdrawal from friends and family, alcohol and drug use, neglecting one's personal appearance, loss of interest in school or schoolwork, and problems focusing. Some of these signs are similar to ones Adam mentioned when he talked about bullying, just to point that out.
So after that, very quickly, she started drinking, and we didn't know she was drinking either until she went to the hospital for alcohol poisoning. At that moment, the hospital felt very strongly that she was a harm to herself. So she went into the psych ward. She was discharged. She was prescribed depression medication, but her erratic behavior continued. She had really highs and she had very many lows, and she was really up and going, or she was just really down and depressed.
Okay, so like I mentioned before, some factors that contribute to teen suicide are the spatial, include suicide contagion and suicide clusters. The spatial or temporal clustering of suicides is more among common youth than among other people. Suicide contagion is a term for the spread of suicidal activity, usually with reference to media influences. It may be associated with sensationalist media reporting of suicide events in the community. So we can say that since her sister was really close to other people with her similar ideas, she was influenced to commit suicide. And as well as her boyfriend committed suicide, she felt like she was alone, and she decided to take her life, I guess. And can you move to the next one? Oops, thank you. So, according to researchers, there's a relationship between suicidal ideation and personal variables. It has been found that suicidal ideation has been a concern, or is the greater concern of many high school and college students. There's a relationship between suicidal ideation and selected personal variables, such as personal characteristics, negative life experiences, and social support. But there is also associations with other factors, such as gender, self-esteem, lack of self-control, depression, drug use, stress, perception of health, family status, and academic performance. Relating to academic performance, suicidal teens, their performance is kind of poor. They are often above average in intelligence, but because of problems in their personal life, they underachieve. So we can say that having a low performance school is also a common factor in suicide in teens. And yeah, can you move to the next one? Thank you. Some common, or yes, common, we can say, characteristics in teens with suicidal ideation are having experienced more negative stress. They are not satisfied with their health. They tend to come from incomplete families. They usually are not among the top achievers. They have fewer people they feel they can rely on in times of need, and they tend to suffer from anomic feelings or feeling socially unstable. Yep. Can you move to the next one? Suicide prevention. There have been some developed strategies. In this case, we're going to be talking about school-based suicide programs, and community-based, and social media-based. This first one, the school-based suicide prevention strategies, include screening students for mental health problems and referring them to mental health professionals, providing teachers with gatekeeper training to recognize depression and other mental health disorders in students and to learn the procedures for referral to mental health services, and peer helper programs and postvention or suicide prevention activities such as crisis and debriefing interventions aimed at teens who recently were exposed to suicide. And yeah, can you move? Thank you. Like I mentioned before, there are some community-based suicide prevention strategies as well. They often target access to methods of self-harm, like construction of bridge safety barriers, detoxification of cooking gas and car exhaust, and the restriction of firearms. It also involves the education of media regarding responsible reporting of suicides and the provision of crisis hotlines.
Yeah, you do. You sound afraid. Yeah. Well, perhaps then we can think of what else you could do to keep yourself safe. Just to get through until morning at least. So while we're on the phone now, do you think you can get rid of that rope and put it outside or put it up somewhere high or where it's not so accessible? No. Okay. Well, it's in the living room now, so can you stay where you are in the bedroom? Okay. That's good to hear. Can you promise me that you won't hurt yourself for the rest of tonight, and then in the morning, or if you do feel like hurting yourself, you'll give us a call before you do anything. We can work out where to go from there. Okay, you are sounding a little bit better, but please do give us a ring back if the thoughts or the desires to end your life come back, okay? All right, you take care of yourself.
All right, so like I mentioned before, there are some social media-based interventions as well. Some people might believe that social media is actually a great influence on causing teens to think or commit suicide. But if we do the right thing and with certain restrictions, social media can be actually a good strategy. So the growing uptake, influence, and diversity of social media platforms pose new opportunities and challenges for the prevention of suicide and self-harm behavior. Recent data from the US suggests that the majority of young people feel comfortable disclosing personal information, such as their psychological and mental health experiences in online environments. For some young people, social media has been shown to reduce a sense of isolation and increase support among peers. The accessibility of social media has the potential to remove barriers and facilitate access to information that can help guide young individuals in the management of their own health and well-being. A key priority for providing safe social media-based interventions involves equipping social media platforms with moderators who are sufficiently skilled and competent to deliver appropriate support to those who may be at risk of suicide. And yep, can do. So I don't think we have time to watch this video. Yeah, she just gives a message and talks about how she was affected and her family was affected, and not only her sister, who was the one who committed suicide. So if you or anyone you know is going through some issues, just know that there is help available. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline has a 24/7 crisis hotline. There's the site and the phone number, and they also have a crisis text line. If you don't want to talk, you can always text. And yeah, I think, yeah, Mark.
Awesome, thank you, Ruby. So I'm gonna go ahead and talk about some youth suicide statistics really quick. Since 2011, there's been a roughly 400% increase nationally in suicide attempt among young people. There was a stable period in the suicide rate from 2000 to 2007. However, at the turn of 2007 going to 2017, there was a dramatic increase, roughly 56%, making suicide the leading cause of death for this age group. To combat suicide rates, more time, money, and resources should be spent on students' mental health and physical well-being. As early as elementary school, school staff can help identify students who are most vulnerable and teach them how to deal with the stresses and crises that they may encounter as they grow. We could also provide more school counselors, school therapists, and workshops to help students talk about how they are doing mentally and physically. On the next slide, we go ahead and talk about suicide rates over the past couple of years. For people from the ages of 10 to 14, suicide rates have tripled in the years of 2007 to 2017, compared to the steady rate that we had talked about earlier in the time period of 2000 to 2007. As we can see in the figure, suicide rates have nearly doubled in comparison to homicide rates as of recent time. Similarly, for people of ages 15 to 19, suicide rates were steady in the years 2000 to 2007. However, in 2007 to 2017, there was a sharp 75% increase in suicide rates, which is quite alarming. As we noted in the figure, in 2011, the suicide rates of the age group 15 to 19 surpassed the homicide rate and is not showing any signs of slowing down. And we can see that on the figure on the right. So I'm going to go ahead and let Adam wrap it up for us.
All right, so we're going to briefly discuss some of the takeaways from today's session about our topics. The first thing we have to do is pretty much realize our responsibility as educators to understand the dynamics and be prepared to intervene during any situation, whether it's bullying, whether we see something about drug abuse, or, you know, if we see something that might indicate a person's contemplating suicide. The thing about it is we have to go about this process reasonably. We can't jump to any conclusions. We have to make sure we gather more information, and pretty much that moves into the intentionality and how it has to be a priority and paramount in order to provide a safe learning environment. This safe learning environment is not something that is going to happen on accident. We have to model certain behaviors for our student. We have to show them how to deal with situations. We have to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. You know, children have to navigate a very complex landscape. And they have a lot more distractions than we did. So as a teacher, he has to make sure that his environment, his teaching classroom, is a place where people can speak and there's equity of voice and they can be heard. And based on our relationship with those students, hopefully we can foster it to the extent where they trust us enough to be able to share us with the fragilities of their situation. As far as awareness and diligence is necessary in order to prevent, intervene, and combat the realities of drug use, suicide, and school bullying. Like I said, this is not something that you're gonna, if you're not looking for it, it's easy to miss. So you have to be aware, you have to know the signs, the symptoms, you have to understand changes in your students' behavior, and understand we're not just talking about our students, we're talking about our children, we're talking about our nephews and nieces and people who are close to us. As far as students are concerned, knowing your students and building relationships that foster trust and communication, it can very well be the difference between life and death. A life can be saved if they, you know, if a child trusts us with the information, and like it was mentioned before, we are mandated reporters, so we do have that responsibility. But reporting and doing that, we'll never know unless the children have the trust in us to come and they believe that we can be of some type of assistance to them. If there's just another face in the back of the classroom, you know, that just somehow eases through the whole process, that's not really trust, that's not a relationship. We have to know our kids, and we have to know to be able to see these shifts in their behavior. And the last thing we're going to say about this whole thing is a life saved is a life lived is a life saved. And so we have Yoda. And we're not just talking about preventing suicide. You know, hopefully we can prevent suicide if it comes to that, but we want to be able to start seeing things way before it gets to that point. The goal is not to have to prevent a suicide, it's to prevent even the contemplation of it, to build confidence in our students so that they can go through life and make choices and handle those choices well. We have to be able to teach our kids how to handle insecurity. You know, we all have insecurities. My nose is too big, or my whatever is too whatever. I'm not smart enough. Nobody is exempt from insecurities, but we, as far as insecurities and fears, we have to teach our children how to deal with those things and how to see them as a hurdle instead of an obstacle. A hurdle is something you get over. An obstacle may be something that you never get past. So it's our job to model the behavior of building empathy, having these relationships, being able to relate to somebody else, even in a situation that may not be our own. And like I said, it could very well be a life or death situation. But just like Yoda said, a life lived is a life saved. You live well, that is a life saved. Thank you, and we appreciate your time.